Well, thank you very much, Stuart. Is my mic turned on? Can folks hear me okay? Well, Stuart was talking about, as you work in the field of wildlife and conservation, once you're in it for 20 or 30 or 40 years, you'll end up with hair like he's got. That is, if you're lucky. Or you could end up with hair like I've got, or lack of hair like John and I both have. So that's what you have to look forward to. So you hope you end up like Stuart with nice, full silver hair. I certainly do. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I've had the opportunity to speak here at the zoo on several occasions. It's a wonderful institution, and Stuart and his staff are just absolutely the best that I've ever come across in this field. They just make everybody feel so welcome and at home, and it's just a wonderful venue to be at. And they do a great job of hosting events like this, as well as our board meeting. Well, what I'm going to be talking about today is not just Vital Ground and the vital work that the Vital Ground organization does, but I'm also going to be talking about this critter, the grizzly bear, and telling you a little bit about grizzly bears and what we're doing to ensure their future. But to start with, Vital Ground, really it is the only organization that is focused on conserving habitat for the grizzly bear. Vital Ground's a nonprofit 501c3. It's been around 25 years. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. We're based in Missoula, Montana, which, as you'll see in a moment, is kind of the epicenter of grizzly bear conservation and recovery in the lower 48 states. And we operate primarily as a land trust. We're not a Save the Bear organization per se. We're focused on protecting the habitat that supports the bear and all of the other critters that live out there. But first, a little bit about why grizzlies? Why do we even use the grizzly as our icon and our compass? And what are some of the myths and perceptions about grizzly bears that people have? There's one right there. Many people, when they think about grizzly bears, they think they're ferocious, bloodthirsty killers. That if you go for a hike in grizzly country, they're going to track you down and bite your head off. But there's other views of grizzly bears as well. There's a little guy there and his little bit bigger sister. So I've got a few photos of bears here just to kind of set the stage. Kind of cute. A little relaxed and happy. Not exactly looking like he's going to bite somebody's head off. Mom and her yearling out fishing. The little guy saying, I know one of those fish is going to come along just any minute now. Where is he? 3 siblings looking for, I think maybe they're looking for a little trouble there. And Mom gets them back in tow. But back to this. That happens to be Doug Seuss and Bart the Bear. And many of you are probably familiar with Bart the Bear, but if you're not, Bart is the bear that has been in so many of the Hollywood movies. He's a huge star. And Bart the Bear was basically adopted by Doug and Lynn Seuss, and they raised Bart as one of their family, and he grew into a tremendous movie star. And really that's what that little guy grew into. Just imagine that to that. And that inspired Doug and Lynn to found Vital Ground and give something back to Bart's wild cousins. And I'd like to divert from the talk for a moment. We do have Lynn Seuss with us in the audience. Lynn, would you stand up? Lynn is co-founder of the Vital Ground Foundation, back in the back there. The mother of Bart the Bear. Bart actually is that one on that side over there. But there's other reasons for using the grizzly bear. I mean, it's more than just the fact that Doug and Lynn raised grizzly bears and cougars and wolves for the movies and wanted to give something back. It's more than that. There's a lot of ecological reasons why an organization would use a grizzly bear to focus its conservation efforts around. For one thing, they're considered a flagship species. I mean, obviously, they're a big, charismatic animal. People get excited about them. They want to take action to protect that animal and its habitat. They're also called an umbrella species. And really, with an umbrella species, you're talking about a critter that really occupies a very broad ecological niche. It is our top predator, and most of all, it really takes a large territory for it to live and survive. And in this photograph there, this represents a spread from the southern end of that aerial photograph to the northern end, which is looking up towards Glacier National Park in Montana. This is the Swan Valley in western Montana. That is one radio-collared grizzly bear over a 2-year period. And from the northern range to the southern range, that's approximately 50 miles that bear wandered over a 2-year period. So you can see they occupy incredibly large landscapes. One of the great reasons why we use them as an umbrella species. They're also called a species of concern. They were listed under Endangered Species Act back in 1975. And obviously, if you read the news about wildlife and conservation, grizzly bears are in the news almost all the time. They are a species of concern that many, many folks are concerned about. Keystone species. Basically, they have an influence on their ecosystem that is much greater than their abundance as an animal. So they're very, very key to the ecological health. And we also call them an indicator species. Basically, they're sort of a barometer. If you're managing the land out there in such a way that the grizzly bear populations are healthy and they're thriving, it means you've got a healthy ecosystem. So it's a great indicator species. So really, you take care of grizzly country, you take care of the habitat needs for all of the other native wildlife that would share that landscape with the grizzly bears. Seeing those bears, even big old guys like him, don't necessarily just go for big critters to feed. But what's really gone on with grizzly bears? So I'm going to give you a little brief history here of the past couple of hundred years. The grizzly bear was first identified and described by Lewis and Clark in their journey back in the early 1800s. And they encountered them way out here in North Dakota. Way over in there is where they first encountered their grizzly bears. And at the time, you know, scientists and historians now look back and estimate that there could have been as many as 100,000 grizzly bears in western North America at the time Lewis and Clark made their expedition just 200 years ago, with 50,000 of those bears just being actually in what is now the lower 48 states. But things changed fast. By 1940, you know, just literally 135 years after Lewis and Clark made their expedition, that estimated 50,000 bears had dropped to only 200 to 300 in the lower 48 states. So quite a dramatic decline in the grizzly bear population. Graphically, you can see that bears in the lower 48 states by 1940 had just about become extinct. And they would have gone extinct had we not taken drastic actions to recover that species. But really, what caused that? Why did that grizzly bear population drop so fast? Well, really what it was a focused extermination effort. I mean, there was a united effort amongst settlers and the government to exterminate the grizzly bear, to rid the land of that vicious predator and make it safe for people to settle. And it wasn't through any sort of a regulated hunting, it was true extermination that eliminated the grizzly bears. Strychnine, the poison, was used extensively back in the late 1800s. Stanley P. Young, in his classic book, The Wolves of North America, had this quote here that basically says, "No cowman would pass a carcass of any kind without inserting in it a goodly dose of strychnine sulfate." So imagine, you know, there's a dead cow on the range, and the rangeman rides by, fills it with strychnine. Any critter that comes along and feeds on it, you know, any type of predator, not just grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, coyotes, eagles, vultures, whatever. It was an extermination effort. So really in that 135-year period, we saw the grizzly bear population plummet from 50,000 bears that were occupying the plains area all the way out to North Dakota through the California. California at one point in time had more grizzly bears than any place in the lower 48 states. By the 1920s, we only had isolated pockets, the little brown islands. By 1922, those are the only places in the lower 48 states that still had any grizzly bears left. Completely gone from California, even though just a few years earlier, more bears there than anywhere. Well, we ask about Alaska. Well, Alaska fortunately still has a very strong grizzly bear population, 35,000 or so. So the question is, well, why worry about grizzly bears? If they're up in Alaska and they're up in Western Canada, why should we even worry about them in the lower 48 states? And I love this quote by Aldo Leopold. It basically says, relegating grizzlies to Alaska is about like relegating happiness to heaven. You may never get there. So I thought that was very insightful for Aldo Leopold to say that many, many years ago on why it's important to protect and conserve the grizzly bear. And this came out of his classic work, A Sand County Almanac. So the grizzly bear was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. We developed a formal recovery plan for it, and that recovery plan included 6 grizzly bear recovery areas in the northwestern United States, right up there. Those areas are the Yellowstone ecosystem, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, Cabinet Yaks, Selkirks, North Cascades, and the Bitterroot ecosystem. That's where the focus has been placed for the last 40 years on recovering grizzly bears in the lower 48. We now have somewhere between 1,800 and 1,900 grizzlies, but they still exist on less than 4% of the range that they occupied when Lewis and Clark came through a couple of hundred years ago. From a population distribution and density perspective, each one of those grizzly bears represents approximately 100 animals. And anytime you're measuring numbers of something like a grizzly bear, it is a certain amount of estimation involved. But they've got a pretty good estimate. We're talking 600 to 700 bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem now, 1,000 plus up in the Northern Continental Divide. But in the Cabinet Yaks and the Selkirks, less than 50 bears in each one of those ecosystems. Over here in the North Cascades, very, very few bears. In fact, for the last 3 years, they've been working really hard to try and positively identify grizzly bears in the North Cascades, and they haven't been able to do that. They think that really the bears in the North Cascades right now may be an occasional wanderer coming down from the Canadian side of the border, or there may be half a dozen bears living there in that remote wilderness, but not a lot of grizzly bears. Bitterroot ecosystem, even though it's one of the recovery areas, it's currently devoid of grizzlies. There are no grizzlies residing there at the moment. So we have made a comeback, but 1,850 bears is a long way from 50,000 bears. And nobody's saying we're going to have 50,000 grizzly bears in the lower 48 states, but we have a lot of work to do to recover that bear to where it's a viable, surviving population that will be around 100 years from now. Because there are challenges. Even though we brought that bear back, we're losing a tremendous amount of habitat. Each and every day, thousands and thousands of acres of wildlife habitat is disappearing, both through loss and what's called habitat fragmentation. And we also have a huge problem with social tolerance of bears on the landscape and human behaviors that cause an unnecessary human-induced mortality on these grizzlies. Dr. Chris Servine is the Grizzly Bear Recovery Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and heads up the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. Chris has been working on grizzly bear recovery for his entire career, 36 years now. Chris has been working on this. And this is a quote from Chris that he actually presented here at the zoo several years ago when he received the George Rabb Award. And that is, in Chris's mind, in the mind of many conservation biologists, the greatest threat to wildlife today is human intrusion into their habitat, continuing erosion of the habitat that we do have left out there. And here's what's happening. That is the Swan Valley of Montana. Beautiful landscape, as wild as it can possibly be. And here's what's happening down in the valley bottoms. It is being carved up and sold off. With the recession we had, it slowed it down. It gave those of us involved in conservation the opportunity to move in and protect some of these lands, but it's picking back up. The pace of land sales is picking back up, and we're continuing to lose vital habitat in those critical areas. And these private land developments that we're seeing are some of the worst things that can happen to habitat. Many times we focus on things such as logging, but really, trees grow back, roads can be closed, access can be managed. But once a subdivision goes in, you don't see a lot of plans and recovery of going in and removing subdivisions. You can manage forest roads and replant trees, but these subdivisions are permanent. And really what they do is they represent a long-term and continuous mortality threat to wildlife. And that's primarily because each and every one of those developments offers an opportunity for an ingenious bear to come along and say, wow, I can get a free meal there. There's dog food outside. There's bird feeders out there. There's barbecues out there in the backyard. Boy, I'm going to go in. Oh, wow, they left their garbage out last night. Boy, that is great. They've got the leftover rib dinner in the garbage. I'm going to investigate that. And that's what happens. Mama comes down, the little cubs come down, and from a very early age, in many of these areas where garbage is not appropriately managed, when the cubs are only a few months old, they become hooked on that. And bears have an incredible memory. They're incredibly smart animals. And you're going to have a recurring problem once you end up in this kind of a situation. They love those bird feeders. And birds really don't need to be fed in May, June, July, and August. Folks should be taking those bird feeders down. Pet food left outside brings those bears in. And this is what happens. Folks call the game and fish department and say, come get this grizzly bear. It's in my backyard. It's on my porch. My kids can't go outside. But you've brought it in yourself. So that bear ends up getting trapped, locked up, hauled off to a new area. 3 strikes and you're out. If the bear keeps coming back, eventually it gets euthanized. And basically that's where the phrase comes from. A fed bear is a dead bear. And this is all generated by this incredible subdivision and development of key wildlife habitat in important linkage areas. The fragmented ecosystems that we were talking about, this breaking up of the habitat, basically what you've got in these grizzly bear recovery areas, these for the most part are large blocks of public land. We have Yellowstone National Park down there. Up there is the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area in Glacier National Park. Over here is the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness Area. You've got the Cabinet Wilderness up here. You've got the Selkirk Wild Area. You've got the North Cascades Wilderness Area. So these huge blocks of protected public lands. But these critters have to move back and forth between those blocks of public land, both for demographic purposes, to support their numbers, for breeding purposes, many times to move to find seasonal habitats. And that is the challenge, because the areas between those, for the most part, are private lands, and that's where the transportation corridors are, that's where the highways are, that's where the railroads are, that's where the subdivisions and developments and commercial developments are put, is right in those valley bottoms where the critters are trying to move across. So really, the way we try and address this and mitigate it is to figure out ways to get these bears and other wildlife safely across the landscape. How can they move from the northern continental divide over to the Cabinet Yaak Wilderness Area and do so without running into so many distractions and so many homes and subdivisions that are not managing their garbage correctly that they never have a chance to actually make it across the landscape. So we focus on linkage zones, and that is where Vital Ground puts a lot of its emphasis, is these linkage zones, which tend to be, for the most part, relatively small, strategically located areas between these large blocks of public land that provide an opportunity for safe passage for these bears to move across. Which really brings us to Vital Ground for Grizzlies. And this is the mission, a nice simple mission for Vital Ground. Protect and restore that habitat, and we also support programs at the community level that helps reduce those conflicts with bears. Vital Ground focuses on private lands. There are a lot of organizations that focus on public land conservation, but Vital Ground focuses on working with these small private landowners that are strategically located between the public lands. We focus on core habitats and we focus on ecosystem connectivity. And what I mean by core habitat is occasionally within these big recovery areas, there'll be small blocks of private land that are put up for sale, maybe for a recreational development or subdivision or golf course or ski area, something like that. So critical places that still need to be protected within these. And then we have the areas between them that need to be conserved. We do this through voluntary transactions. We always work with landowners on a voluntary basis. A landowner that wants to do this, they're basically a willing participant. We do it by conservation easements, and that's basically where the landowner continues to own the land himself, but they give up the right to do certain types of developments on their property. For example, a person may own 160 acres, and they might do a conservation easement with Vital Ground that says, you know, we really don't want to subdivide our 160 acres, so we're going to place a covenant on it and a restriction which will limit us to one home on each of our 80-acre parcels, and the rest of it will remain open space for wildlife. It also permits agricultural activities, so we can work with folks in rural areas that want to continue their ranching and their farming operations by protecting the integrity of that habitat, because if we're protecting that habitat, it's still good for ranching and farming and timber growing. We also occasionally actually buy the land ourselves. I mean, sometime we come across an incredibly important parcel of land, and a person says, you know, I would really like to help you protect that, but that is my entire retirement. You know, my whole future for the next 30 years is going to be based on what I can get by selling this property. And right now, a person wants to pay me $2 million to put in a subdivision. And if it's in the right place and is really important for wildlife, Vital Ground will step in and try and negotiate a purchase on that and protect it, and then ultimately look for a conservation buyer to take it off our hands that would manage it for conservation. And we also get a lot of our work done by working with other conservation partners. We don't feel like we have to be the lead organization on every single project out there. There's lots of great organizations working in Grizzly Country, the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, Trust for Public Land. So we work with many of these groups by providing funding grants to assist them to do their work. And Vital Ground is an accredited land trust, a process that we went through last year. And actually, it was about a 5-year process. We became accredited last year, and we're one of about 250 land trusts in the entire country that has received the seal of accreditation. So we're very proud of the fact that we're recognized by our peers. And since 1990, we've been able to accomplish about 600,000 acres of conservation in several states, British Columbia, and on up into Alaska, working with a great number of partners. And these are just a few of the partners that Vital Ground has worked with over the years. But two specifically that I'd like to point out are the Brookfield's American Association of Zookeepers chapter, right here at the Brookfield Zoo. This group of folks has been an absolutely incredible partner and supporter of Vital Ground's efforts. And they presented another check last night at our reception, and it brings them up, I think, Ryan, you were keeping track of that. What's the total? Looks like Ryan, my data man, left. But I think the Brookfield chapter is up over $50,000 now that they have donated to Vital Ground through their annual spaghetti fundraiser that they put on here to help Vital Ground do these incredible projects. And we also have the Chicago Zoological Society itself through their conservation fund as an incredible supporter. So I want to offer a special thank you to Dr. Straw, because together the Zoological Society's Conservation Fund and the AAZK chapter have collectively contributed over $100,000 to Vital Ground in just the last few years to help with these on-the-ground conservation projects. So let's give them a round of applause. Well, like to give you just a couple of quick examples of projects that Vital Ground is involved in and has done over the years. Again, talking about the core habitat opportunity to pick up isolated parcels and then those ecosystem connectivity ones. A great example of a core habitat project is Bismarck Meadows, which is located in northern Idaho. You see from that photo, it's a pretty spectacular place. Bismarck Meadows, a little red dot right up there. It's right in the heart of the Selkirk Grizzly Bear Recovery Zone. It's surrounded by public land, but it's also privately owned. So you've got this situation where you've got this 1,100-acre wet meadow. It's incredibly important for grizzly bears in the spring. They come out of hibernation, they come down to the valley, they head right for that meadow because it's one of the few wet meadows in the area. Sows and cubs are usually the ones that come down and take advantage of that, but it is privately owned. And when Vital Ground got involved with this project about 12 years ago, there were 6 different landowners that owned that 1,100 acres. And who knows what those landowners would ultimately do with that property long term. So Vital Ground's goal in our strategy has been to go in, develop relationships with those landowners, talk to them about conservation strategies, and then actually offer to purchase their property if and when they ever wanted to sell it. So over the last 10 years, we've made some pretty good progress. We purchased the first piece in 2005. It was only 19 acres, but we've built on that. In 2008, we picked up a second parcel. 2009, a third parcel. In 2010, a fourth parcel. So now Vital Ground owns approximately half of that meadow, and we're managing it for conservation. There's 2 parcels remaining, the southern half of the meadow. We're maintaining relationships with those landowners. Right now, they have no intention of selling their property, no intention of developing it, but at some point in time, that land will change ownership. Vital Ground wants to be their buyer of choice when that happens, so we can continue to protect that meadow. So I use this project to show that conservation is a long-term endeavor. This project was on our books, and Vital Ground was working on it before I began my tenure with Vital Ground back in 2004. And here it is, 2015, and we're approximately halfway done with that project. It may be another 10 years before we wrap up Bismarck Meadows and get the rest of it purchased. So it's a long-term commitment. The second type of project, ecosystem connectivity. This is up there, kind of right in that area between the panhandle of Idaho and extreme northwestern Montana. It's called the Selkirk Purcell Cabinet Linkage Initiative. And really, it's about identifying those very small, important areas to allow wildlife to move across the landscape. And Vital Ground is a small organization. We only have 6 staff people. So we don't have the luxury or the fun of actually going out on the field and putting radio collars on bears and tracking them around ourselves. But there are people that do that. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Idaho Fish and Game Department, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the universities, they have that kind of research going on. We have great relationships with those agencies and those researchers, and we use the research that they provide to help inform our conservation decision making. So these areas basically have been identified as critical linkage areas for the grizzly bear. So we get the information from the scientist, that focuses Vital Ground in on where we should work. We then go into those linkage areas. We start identifying the land ownership patterns. Who owns what land? Up there, the green is national forest, the yellow is private timber company, and then the red is small private landowners. Our job is to go in, start talking to those landowners, finding out who is receptive to conservation and what might work for them, either a conservation easement or an acquisition or just a good management plan recognizing that they want to manage their property for wildlife. A couple of years ago, we wrapped up our first project in that Selkirk Linkage Zone. It's a Yak Mountain property. It's a small property acre-wise. It's only 71 acres. But it was very strategically located right there in the valley bottom as those bears were able to move across the valley. It was the #1 spot the biologists had identified in that region of western Montana for getting across the landscape. We had a great partner in that. Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative came in and partnered with us and provided half of the funding for that project. And then the Chicago Zoological Society and the Brookfield chapter of the AAZK contributed significant funding directly to that project as well. So there we are, unlocking the gate, our first visit to the property after we close the transaction. That's what it looks like now. Could be filled with half a dozen homes had Vital Ground not purchased it. So that's an example of really part of our guiding philosophy, and that is we don't need to purchase thousands and thousands of acres out there to protect the land for the bears and the other wildlife, because we have these big blocks of public land. But we need to protect hundreds of acres that are located in exactly the right spot to allow these critters to move across the landscape and move safely across the landscape. And we kind of depict that with a little jigsaw puzzle showing these little holes in the landscape that the scientists have identified as the critical linkage zones on the landscape. And so when we do our fundraising for these projects, we call it our Right Place campaign, because we're raising money for the right places to protect. We also mentioned briefly working with communities to try and minimize those conflicts. Again, Vital Ground has a small staff. We don't have enough capacity ourselves to go out into the communities, so we partner with community organizations that are embedded in these small rural communities that do great work. This is a project we did last year. It was with the Swan Valley Bear Resources. Swan Valley is an area in western Montana that Vital Ground has a dozen conservation easements located throughout. Very important to us, but it kind of undermines our on-the-ground conservation work if grizzly bears get in the garbage and get hauled away or get euthanized. So we worked with a couple of local groups, the Swan Ecosystem Center and the Northwest Connections Group in Condon, Montana. They have a collaborative where they work with local residents to raise their awareness of living in bear country, managing garbage, taking care of garbage. They provide electric fences for folks that have fruit trees, again, to minimize those conflicts. So we work with partners right there in the local area and try and get the money into their hands so they can do the good work that they do. Well, here's what the future is for grizzlies. As I mentioned, we've done a pretty good job of bringing the bear back from the brink of extinction 40 years ago. We're up to the point now where the Fish and Wildlife Service is considering removing the grizzly bear from the threatened endangered species list in the Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. So really it would be this population is the first one they're considering. The Northern Continental Divide is the second one that they're considering. So removing it from the endangered species list basically means that the grizzly bear management would be returned to the state wildlife agencies, that it would have reached its threshold for recovery from the Fish and Wildlife Service standards, and you turn that management back over to the state agencies. It doesn't mean that grizzly bears would be identified as predators to be shot on sight. It means that the management authority would rest with the state agencies rather than the federal agencies. And to do that, the states have to adopt a conservation strategy developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that really outlines how those grizzly bear populations would be managed by the states once they're removed from the threatened and endangered species list. So that conservation strategy would guide the state's management. And if it's done correctly, and that's the big if this is done correctly, recovery is a success. When you get to the point where a population no longer requires the extra federal protections, if you've done enough to make sure that it is viable and can survive into the future, and you can remove it from the endangered species list, that's a success, because you want to remove wildlife from the endangered species list. You don't want to put something on the endangered species list and have it there forever, because if you're successful at recovering it, you can remove it from the threatened endangered species list. That's what we'd like to do. We'd like to get to the point that those bears are going to survive out there without that extra level of federal protection. But it's all about how we go about doing it. But the important thing from Vital Ground is that once that happens, habitat conservation is still important. Private land conservation will probably be more important than it was in the past. And working in those communities to minimize conflicts will be more important than ever because there's more bears on the landscape now than there was 40 years ago. There's more potential for conflicts. So Vital Ground is going to be doing the same kind of work that we're doing today well into the future, regardless of what the federal government does with its listing or delisting status. We're still going to be protecting those crucial private lands. We're still going to be working with those communities to minimize conflicts. And Doug Seuss is still putting his head inside a bear's mouth. This is Little Bart, the successor to Big Bart. And Little Bart is now, I think, 15 years old. And Doug hasn't learned that he shouldn't be putting his head inside a grizzly bear's mouth, but he still does it. And as Lynn Seuss says, where the grizzly can walk, the earth is healthy and whole. So thank you very much for your time and attention this morning. We appreciate it. There you go. We got a bit of a late start this morning. Do we still have time for a few questions? Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Certainly, and that's a really good question. Unlike the other recovery areas that had grizzly bears in them when they were placed on the threatened and endangered species list, there were no grizzlies in the Bitterroot at the time. And it's a pretty long walk from Yellowstone or Glacier National Park or the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area to get to the Selway Bitterroot area. So really, the grizzly bears have not been able to naturally repopulate that area. As part of the Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery plan, the plan was to actually reintroduce grizzlies to the Selway Bitterroot. A number of years ago, when the national administration changed, when George Bush was elected president, basically he got a lot of pressure from the governor of Idaho at the time, Dirk Kempthorne, who basically said, we don't want grizzly bears in the Selway Bitterroot. So basically the president's administration shelved the Fish and Wildlife Service's plan to reintroduce grizzly bears into the Selway Bitterroot. So right now the strategy is to really focus on these linkage areas to provide opportunities for the bears to safely get there on their own. So as grizzly bear populations increase in places like Yellowstone, the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area, the Cabinet Yaak, those bears naturally move out, trying to find new homes. And if we've got appropriate linkage areas for them, sooner or later they will get to the Bitterroot. And in fact, I think it was 6 years ago, a grizzly bear did make it to the Bitterroot. And it came from, through DNA analysis, they were able to tell that it came from the Selkirk population in northern Idaho. Unfortunately, that grizzly bear was shot by a black bear hunter. Legally licensed black bear hunter. There weren't supposed to be any grizzly bears in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness Area. A bear showed up, he shot it, and turned out it was a grizzly bear. So that's the only grizzly bear that's been documented in the Selway Bitterroot for the last 30 years or so. Other questions? Yes?
So, when I look at the map of the grizzlies' habitat, that somehow overlaps with the northern Rocky Mountain Gray Wolves, right? And they have been recently delisted, just from the Yellowstone, Idaho, Wyoming, that area.
I'm sorry, I can't quite, do we have a remote mic that we could take out to the audience? I can't quite hear the question. Thank you.
So, see, the habitat, the maps that you showed of grizzlies, they actually overlap quite a bit from my understanding of the northern Rocky Mountain gray wolves, right? And the gray wolves have recently been delisted from the Endangered Species Act. But I was wondering, and so right now they are at shoot-at-sight and what have you, and it's an open season for gray wolves in those areas. And so I was wondering if delisting it was necessarily a good idea, even if it's if the protection of the species is relegated to the local states. because then you have different states doing different things. It's not a cohesive effort, right? And so what's so wrong with leaving them on the endangered species list? I mean, that's much more comprehensive.
It's good question. In terms of the wolves, you know, they're completely different animals in terms of their biology and fecundity. Wolves are on one end of the spectrum. They reproduce very rapidly. They spread very rapidly. They cover lots of country. Grizzly bears are on the total opposite end of the spectrum in terms of reproductive capacity and growing the population. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, when they're talking about delisting, they're being much, much more conservative with grizzly bears than they were with gray wolves in terms of their delisting. They have a much tighter conservation strategy that they're rolling out. In fact, their conservation strategy is so tight right now that the states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming have not yet agreed that they would sign on to it. And if they don't sign on to it, they're not going to be proposed for delisting. So it's a much tighter conservation strategy. And as part of the conservation strategy, for example, in the Yellowstone ecosystem, even though the Yellowstone covers 3 different states, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, that conservation strategy would determine mortality limits for that population, not just mortality limits for what's in Idaho, Wyoming, or Montana. So it's going to force the states to work together and collaborate and make sure that if any of the states decide to have a hunting season, it would be a very, very limited hunting season because the Fish and Wildlife Service would determine what that mortality level could be. So it's going to be a totally different situation when it comes to delisting grizzlies than it was with the gray wolves, driven both by the biology of the animal and the politics of the animal and the support for the animal. But it is a good question, and that's one of the reasons that the whole concept of delisting grizzlies is receiving a lot of public pushback, is because of what happened with the delisting of the gray wolves. And that was bungled quite a bit, and is still being bungled, I think.
I guess my last point was it's actually a critical habitat, right? And it supports a lot more than just your apex predators.
Mm-hmm.
So why not just let it be? Have that whole region that's right now out of the habitat for all these either gray wolves or for grizzlies be protected.
Well, a lot of the habitat, yeah.
And then you're scaling back. It seems like you're going back and forth.
Yeah.
And with climate change issues, and human is that.
Yeah.
So my whole point is from a policy perspective, might as well let it be.
Well, a lot of the habitat is permanently protected, like Yellowstone National Park. There's no hunting in Yellowstone National Park. There's no hunting in Glacier National Park. So a lot of these core areas, even though they are within an area that has been delisted, there is no hunting within those areas, and those animals are fully protected within some areas like that. That doesn't apply to national forests, and it certainly doesn't apply to the private lands. But big areas, when you're talking about, for example, delisting the Yellowstone grizzlies, that doesn't mean that people are going to be going inside Yellowstone National Park and hunting grizzlies. Even if Wyoming did have a grizzly bear hunting season, they would not be hunting in Yellowstone National Park. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Sorry, one last question about the wolves. I know there's a lot of conflicts between farmers and wolves. Is there any kind of way maybe there's any methods where maybe instead of using legal methods by the farmers for worrying back up, making sure wolves don't get their livestock, maybe non-lethal ways to observe them maybe?
I think I got most of your question. Again, I couldn't quite hear everything in the back, but
Because I know a lot of times for past conflicts between wolves and because I know a lot of times with conflicts between farmers and wolves, it's farmers get irritated if wolves start attacking their livestock, and I know a lot of times they use more a lethal method. So is there any kind of recommended or maybe in place maybe strategy or not strategy, sorry, non-lethal deterrence maybe, so they can the livestock are still there but it doesn't kill off the wolves?
yeah, actually there's a number of programs in place. Some of them are effective. Some of them are effective some of the time. Sometimes they're not effective. But The Defenders of Wildlife has been a really great organization in terms of working with private landowners and providing methods and means and funding for them to experiment with various types of non-lethal methods for minimizing, depredation and conflicts with their livestock, ranging all the way from providing electric fencing in search situations to providing funding for range riders. For example, Vital Ground at our board meeting yesterday, we received a proposal from a community group called the Blackfoot Challenge in the Blackfoot Valley of Montana, which is a collaborative of conservationists and ranchers, and we're helping to fund a range rider out there to work with the landowners and work with the livestock to basically help mitigate and prevent those conflicts with both bears and wolves. So there's a number of programs in place. None of them are 100% effective, but they can, in certain locales, really cut down on depredation problems by basically eliminating some of the attractants that bring those predators in. Yeah, there's a lot going on in that regard, and there are a lot of folks working on that. Okay. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Gary.